Pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile. Welcome again to Baden Hill. It's springtime. Hope has returned. We're coming to the end of the war to end all wars. It seems as if there can be a happy ending. The good guys have won. The problem is that even the good guys are human beings. And we can see that one sin leads to another. So we're going to talk now about Versailles. And this installment I am calling No Victory at Versailles. Now I want to clarify that because the idea that Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, had was that the war could be ended without victory. His idea was to have peace without victory. And the reason for that was he knew that whoever was victorious would be seen as the new enemy, and those who were defeated would want to get revenge. So this is the story not of a happy ending, but of the plotting of revenge for the future. So we have all kinds of things that happened as a result of World War I. And some of them are very exciting and do give us hope. We want to talk first of all about how women started to be seen as equals to men because of World War I. Many things happened as a result of the men in societies in Western Europe and in Germany and in Russia and also in the United States being called on to serve in this world war. What happened was there was a huge vacuum at home. When all the men were gone, the women had to step into traditionally male roles and jobs. This actually helped African American women as well. So what happened was the men were gone, women took over men's jobs, and then African American women who basically were limited to work as domestic servants, not that different from the jobs that people had when African Americans were slaves. Well, those African American women then were able to step into the roles of secretaries and factory workers, filling some of the jobs that women were leaving behind. So it's a process, and I think that we can see hope in all of this. Women were in charge of making munitions. That means the explosives. So they worked with TNT. And as a result, their skin would become yellow because of all the chemicals they were using. And that was a tragedy. As many as 400 women probably died of their exposure to these chemicals for making bombs. Another role that women had, they couldn't serve as soldiers officially in the U.S. Army. We'll talk mainly about the U.S., but we'll touch on Britain as well. They couldn't serve as soldiers in combat officially, but a good number of women did end up serving in that role. And some were recognized as having served with valor and fought with great courage. One way that women served were as yeomen. So the Navy had a loophole, and they had some loose language that allowed women to become sailors, yeomen, and those women generally served in naval bases, and they replaced the men who were being deployed overseas. And so largely the U.S. women involved, they were serving on military bases or naval bases. Another way that women served was as nurses, because they couldn't even serve as doctors. The medical corps was limited to men. And so women stepped into the nurses' role, which had been happening all the way back into the 1800s, but many of those nurses were actually placed in harm's way. And so many of the women who died in World War I were nurses who were at the front lines. In fact, the nurses were sent ahead of the soldiers before the American soldiers were even sent once the United States joined the war. So women were a huge part of the war effort. I need to tell you as well that ambulance drivers were something new. Motorized vehicles, motor cars were being used for the first time as ambulances. And this is a huge thing because so many of the soldiers, as I've tried to tell you, they once they were injured, they ended up dying. It was incredible, even with fairly minor injuries because of the infections that happened because they couldn't get treatment quickly. And so one of the things that happened was these ambulances needed ambulance drivers, and women became ambulance drivers. One of the most famous was Marie Curie, and she along with her husband basically did many scientific experiments with radioactive elements, and they were able to develop X-rays. And so what she did is she created an ambulance with a mobile X-ray machine, and there were many of these vehicles called little Curies. That's what the name for these little X-ray mobiles were called, little Curies. And Marie Curie actually used her own vehicle, and she constantly was going and helping with X-rays of soldiers who were injured in the war. She actually she thought that because of that service, she probably was exposed to so much radiation that it eventually killed her. In the end, it led to her illness and death eventually. So she gave her life to help others, save others. So there's a positive silver lining in this because women are able to gain some more status. In the Navy, in fact, they were receiving equal pay with the other yeomen who were men. So female yeomen received the same pay. And largely that was because of the loophole. In other cases, women were paid much less. And this became a huge problem because if the men left and the women came in and they were being paid much lower wages, well, what's going to happen when the war ends and the men come back? Are they going to get their jobs back for the same pay that they had before? Or will those factories and the companies want to have wages low so they have more profits? And so there was this concern that this would affect the men coming back and it would create social instability. So even something that should be seen as a positive ends up being a little bit of a negative. Well, women gain status, and one of the things that they were able to do was push for voting rights. Now, this had been happening all the way back into the mid-1800s, and there had been momentum building. Largely, women had been protesting peacefully. We would say that they weren't pushing things too hard, and they weren't making a lot of progress, unfortunately. And so in the early 20th century, women's rights movements, the leaders started being more vocal, and they started protesting in very public places and having parades. And the idea was they didn't want to be limited to inside spaces in the home anymore. They wanted to claim outside public spaces for themselves, because it's not fair that women were basically closed into their homes and expected to do everything in the home while men were able to be outside. And so that's a very big generalization, but hopefully you can understand the idea and how symbolic it was to have these parades of, we call them suffragettes, marching down the street. Suffrage is the allowance to vote, and universal suffrage is something that we've talked about, the idea that everyone should be allowed to vote. Goes back to people like John Stuart Mill, we talked about. And, communism and socialism, they actually believed more in equal rights for men and women than did many of the traditional democracies. So the suffrage movement is building, and we will talk later about two women, Emmeline Pankhurst and Alice Paul. Alice Paul was one who really got in the face of even the president, protesting right outside the White House. Right around the time that the United States was getting ready to enter the war, the women's rights and suffrage movement was really getting going, and Alice Paul really gets a lot of credit for pushing it forward. Another group that in some ways benefited from this war were African Americans. Now, African Americans had served all the way back to the Civil War. Remember this freedom that they gained, and the idea of freedom that they could fight for, that really motivated African Americans to serve in the military. And in 1866, there were actually, this is after the Civil War, there were regiments that were established for African Americans. Now, you got to remember that even though African Americans were given their citizenship, they were separated by laws. We call them Jim Crow laws or codes, black codes that were established to keep white people and black people separate. So even though the African Americans were a part of the military, they weren't allowed to be with everybody else. The most famous groups, going back to what we call the Indian Wars, the wars against Native American tribes, with the U.S. Army fighting those tribes and trying to restore order in their mind. But really it was about, oppression and even extermination of Native American groups. So during those Indian Wars, African Americans fought valiantly, and the Native Americans actually saw them and they gave them a nickname, and it was Buffalo Soldiers. And so Buffalo Soldiers is something that we have touched on. They fought in the Spanish-American War. That's one of the most famous engagements that they had. They fought in Cuba, some in Puerto Rico. And so they were gaining some respect for sure. And one person who respected them greatly was John J. Pershing. And he gained a nickname. And at the beginning, his nickname came from the fact that he believed that these African American soldiers were equal to white soldiers and should be treated with respect. And because he associated with those soldiers and had command over them in certain cases, he was ostracized by racist white soldiers, and they connected him with those black soldiers, and so he became known as Black Jack. Many people probably don't know the origin of that nickname, and it's kind of a cool nickname, cool sounding. John J. Black Jack Pershing. And Pershing was the guy who chased Pancho Villa. If you remember, we've studied him, and he was, in charge of the U.S. Army during that Mexican Revolution period, and then on into World War I, and he became the commander-in-chief, not in chief, but the commander of the American Expeditionary Force. Remember, the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, that's the British forces, and the American Expeditionary Force is the AEF, and Pershing was in charge of the AEF. So Pershing wanted to use Buffalo Soldiers, he wanted to use African American soldiers, but there was still a lot of government pushback. And people in the government did not want African Americans representing America in this war. Terrible racism. And this is in the 19-teens, right, during the World War I. And so eventually those soldiers were basically handed over to the French to be under French command, and they wore blue helmets, and so that was another badge of honor for them. They were known as the Blue Helmets, the Buffalo Soldiers in the blue helmets. And they fought valiantly and earned many medals of honor, medals of valor. So there's progress, but there's also terrible racism, and President Wilson is implicated in this. He did not disagree with this. He allowed others to push this policy. He segregated the U.S. government, saying black and white people couldn't work together in the U.S. government. And he also he pushed segregation in the military. And so this is a terrible stain on the United States in the 20th century, at a time when racism was causing wars and even holocausts. Now, after the war, actually at the end of the war, in January, February of 1918, there was an outbreak of influenza, the Spanish flu. And it was a terrible strain of the flu. Usually flu affects people who are very young, very old, or very weak. Now, many of the soldiers were very weak, and just the world in general had broken down because of this constant fighting. And so, yes, there were weak people, and flu spread and cholera spread. But what happened is, at a military base at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, the first cases of influenza appeared. But they quickly spread everywhere, and they affected healthy people, previously healthy people, and completely threatened them, and in many cases the flu was very deadly. And so some estimates say that 500 million people died from the Spanish flu from 1918 to 1920. And this makes it one of the deadliest disasters, outbreaks in human history. You can imagine that all this suffering and the fact that these bad things were now infecting, literally, the United States. Many Americans after World War I, after they had had some parades for soldiers coming home, they wanted to be out of everything related to Europe, related to war. And so a new policy started to develop. Warren G. Harding was a Republican who was basically competing with Woodrow Wilson, fighting this idea that you could bring the world together in a League of Nations. And Harding was a man who basically was supporting isolationism, that America needed to take care of itself and not try and solve the world's problems. This is something that America has done again and again, unfortunately. After a great act that we celebrate, where the United States goes and helps the world solve a problem, many Americans start to withdraw and turn inwardly. And this results in a cycle of violence, because the United States wants to just get out of everybody else's mess. And so isolationism means pulling in, and we did discuss this earlier. It is a cycle. It happens more than once in history, and it would lead to further war. Now, who are the winners and losers in this war? It's very difficult to see, honestly, any winners. There were people who felt entitled to some benefits from this war, and as a result, the Versailles Conference became a revenge fest. And France, who had suffered so much during the war, felt that this was their chance to get even for that Franco-Prussian War of 1870, and also to get back some of the territory they had lost, and to make sure that Germany would never rise again. And to do this, they wanted to institute very difficult policies against the Germans. Now, 4 people were instrumental, 4 leaders of Western countries were basically in charge of the Versailles Conference. Remember, Germany wasn't really allowed to be a part of it at all. They only arrived at the end after everything had been discussed. And so the big 4 were David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, of the UK, Georges Clemenceau, who was the leader of France. You had Vittorio Emanuele Orlando from Italy, and he was a lesser player because he really didn't have much interest in anything outside of Italy. And then you had President Woodrow Wilson of the United States, who had really been gaining momentum and showing that the United States was ready to be a world power and a leader on the world stage. And so he had come up with these 14 points, which we will discuss, 14 points that could bring peace to the world. He was an idealist, but you will probably come to see that he was quite arrogant in his understanding of how peace might be achieved. And we can see the signs, the cracks in his heroic figure because of the racist segregation that he promoted. So Woodrow Wilson was this president who didn't want to get involved in war. And remember, Teddy Roosevelt, the former president, was basically at odds with President Wilson. Now, you should know that Teddy Roosevelt lost his own son in the war. So not only was he promoting the war, he actually saw his own son die as a result of U.S. involvement. That's a whole interesting story. Did he blame Wilson? If he did, then he has to remember that he was the one who wanted the U.S. to get into the war. And so, Woodrow Wilson is this president. He was reelected to basically stay out of the war. And then, because of the Zimmerman telegram, basically, the United States knew that it couldn't be isolated anymore during the war. Well, Wilson came up with 14 points, and he was a very smart man. He had been the president of Princeton University, and so he was a thinker. And so the 14 points essentially say, number one, if agreements are made among countries, they have to be out in the open. You can't have secret agreements. And we might remember the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk between Lenin and Germany that really threw everybody off and led to some of these terrible battles in World War I, because Eastern Front basically closed, and then all that Germany had to do was fight in the Western Front. And so that led to a spring offensive in 1918, kind of a second wind for Germany, and it almost won the war for Germany and lost it for everybody else. So the 14 points say agreements should be open. In addition, the waters of the world should be free for traffic. There should be international waters. And yes, countries have territorial waters that are theirs, and other ships should not go there. But there should be international waters. And that was important, especially the Dardanelles, remember, because the Dardanelles were connecting the Black Sea with the Mediterranean Sea, and they were extremely important for countries like Russia. And remember, the Ottoman Empire had blocked the Dardanelles, and that led to Gallipoli and many losses of soldiers. So openness, that's a theme. In addition, the idea that peoples of the world should be able to elect their own leaders, and the idea was to make the world safe for democracy. But the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they were empires that included peoples that didn't want to be a part of those empires. They wanted to be their own countries. We think of, Serbia had broken away, but we think of Bosnia, Montenegro, and lots of Balkan countries. We also think of places like Poland and Czechoslovakia. So the map of Europe was radically redrawn. And again, Wilson's idea was allow populations to decide who they want to be ruled by. And this included colonies. Now, this was extremely radical. And you've got to remember that the UK and France had many colonies. And so they're not going to be very accommodating for what President Wilson wants to do, allowing colonies to be free and independent. One of those colonies, by the way, was French Indochina, Vietnam, and that would lead to basically a century of war. As the people there wanted freedom, they thought President Wilson would support their freedom, and then America kind of backed off when the other allies didn't want to give colonies their freedom. So what ended up happening, especially in the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire fell apart. Remember, Lawrence of Arabia had helped that battle. And part of what happened was the Arab nomads in the area, the Arab warriors, they fought for the Allies because they were promised that they would have their own country. And Lawrence of Arabia basically made the promise to them. And so he saw, though, that it wasn't likely that Britain and France were going to keep their promises. And so this is very, very dangerous. And I'll tell you, this probably leads to most of the terrorism and the religious fighting, just the problems in the Middle East that we have to this day. And so what France and England did, I'll say England, Great Britain, they basically divided up the Middle East, and England got what was called Palestine, and France got Lebanon and Syria and those areas. Now, Iraq was the oil fields and was basically connected to the British. There was a leader named Gertrude Bell who was kind of able to govern Iraq alongside an Arab king named Faisal. And we'll talk about that later. So after Versailles, one thing I didn't mention, the most important thing, is the League of Nations. So point 14 of the 14 points is the League of Nations. And this was the most important thing. Wilson could let everything else go, but the League of Nations had to be in the final agreement in the Treaty of Versailles. And so he was able to secure that. Everybody agreed, we'll have a League of Nations. And then he had to go back to the United States, and he had to go around on a huge journey to promote the League of Nations and the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles. And so for basically the rest of his presidency, he fought and fought and fought for the League of Nations. And in very sad, in October of 1919, so the treaty is finished in the late spring and summer, and then less than 6 months later, President Wilson had a stroke. So he was exhausted from his trip. He went home, he had a stroke, and his wife, Edith, actually had to take over. And she didn't want people to know about Wilson's stroke, partly because she didn't trust the Republicans who were fighting against the League of Nations. And so sometimes she even signed his name. Now, if people knew about it, they could have accused her of treason, and that would have been very, very bad for the country and for her. So Wilson's stroke was a dramatic event. He wasn't able to do what he wanted to do, and the Treaty of Versailles was never ratified in the United States. So, not a happy ending. We need to talk about the terms of this treaty, at least in a general way. You know that it established the League of Nations, and eventually that would be a problem-solving group, similar to the Congress of Vienna, similar to some of these alliances, only it wasn't just one alliance versus another alliance. It was actually everybody coming together, and it should have been an improvement. So that was one of the things that came out of the Treaty of Versailles. In addition, the territories of Alsace and Lorraine, which had been taken over by Germany after they won the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, well, France gets to get revenge and take back those territories. And also the German colonies that had been established. Remember the Scramble for Africa, the Berlin Conference? Well, Germany lost its colonies in southwest Africa, where we have a country of Namibia. That was Germany's colony, and so that shifted as well. You have Qingdao in China, which I've mentioned before was a place where beer was being brewed because Germans controlled it, and the Germans lost that colony essentially to the Japanese. And so Germany was losing everything. The military in Germany had to be reduced so that they would never be a threat again to the rest of Europe. And they were not allowed to have an air force or a navy. And there was also an area created. So you've got Alsace and Lorraine, and then you've also got this little area above called the Saar, S-A-A-R, Saarland. And then finally you have an area that's even further into Germany that was called the Rhineland. So the Rhine River, and then the areas along the Rhine River are the Rhineland. So you've got Alsace, Lorraine, the Saarland, and Rhineland. And basically this huge chunk of Germany is being gouged out. This is how far the revenge of the French went. Now, they would justify it by saying, we are defending ourselves so that the Germans never try and do this again. And so the Rhineland was a demilitarized zone. It wasn't taken over by France, but it was occupied by the forces of France and in the UK and the United States. And so the Saarland was actually separated from Germany. So Alsace and Lorraine became French. The Saarland was German, but it was separated from Germany. And then the Rhineland was occupied. So it's kind of three different things going on in that area between France and Germany. And finally, reparations. Millions and millions and millions of dollars were expected from the French by the Germans. So the Germans had to pay the French for starting the war and all of the pain and the suffering they had caused during the war. And in addition, part of the occupation of the military took over the Ruhr land, the Ruhr Valley, which is the primary industrial area of Germany. And because of that, Germany was unable to restart its economy after the war. And we will see the effects on Germany. Now, the colonized world, they're pretty excited because after World War I, they finally have an opportunity for self-determination. And we've already mentioned that Vietnam was affected by this. It was known as French Indochina, right? And we will discuss this much more in the next video series, which is focused on places like Vietnam and post-colonialism. But just know Ho Chi Minh, the leader of Vietnam eventually, he actually studied in the US and the UK and in France. And he was there during the Versailles conference, and he tried to get the Allies to listen to him to give Vietnam its freedom, and they didn't listen. And Lawrence of Arabia actually was at the Versailles conference as a spokesperson and translator for Prince Faisal, who was the leader of these Arab peoples. And he was very frustrated because he knew that the promise would not be kept, but he did help secure the creation of a new Arab nation called Iraq. So Iraq was the nation that was created because of Lawrence of Arabia, Prince Faisal, and World War I. The Ottoman Empire, now I've referred to it as the old man of Europe, and that's not correct. I apologize. It's really the sick man of Europe. So yes, the Ottoman Empire had been 600 years old, and old men tend to get sick. And so in this case, the sick man of Europe was this Eastern question that had been lingering for decades, all the way back to the Crimean War of the 1800s. And so the Ottoman Empire is totally done. And all that's left is Turkey. All of the parts that were controlled by the Ottoman Empire, we knew that Bulgaria had gotten its independence, and Greece and all these other countries. Well, now it's just Turkey. And Turkey then is in the terms of the Versailles Treaty and the 14 points, the idea is to allow the country of Turkey to re-enter the international community. This was true for Russia, by the way. The 14 points were saying that all troops that had invaded Russia, remember Pershing had basically sent troops into Russia, into Siberia, and the Russians won't forget that to this day. Well, all troops should be removed from Russia, and Russia should be allowed to rejoin the international community as well. That was Wilson's plan. But the Ottoman Empire, it was, again, controlling the Middle East, and when it stopped controlling the Middle East, there was a lot of chaos, and that has led to a lot of the conflict that we have today. Africa's colonies were in total disarray, and they wanted their independence, but it would be another 30 years, 40 years before most of them got their independence. India was promised by the UK that they would be able to gain independence after World War I, but England did not follow through in India. And all of the Indian soldiers who had fought so bravely, and they volunteered to fight for their own freedom, very similar to the African American slaves who fought for the Union, suddenly the promise was taken away and was not fulfilled. And China was humiliated because their territory, even though some of it had been controlled by the Germans, it was given to the Japanese, and the Japanese and Chinese had become enemies over the centuries, and that would intensify in the 20th century. And so that led to the May 4th movement, where basically Chinese students protested what was happening at Versailles and said, no more, we're not going to allow foreigners to control our destiny anymore. And this has led to how China feels today. Finally, very quickly, I just want to say this is where Hitler came from. You need to know that World War I is called World War I because it's only the first part of a tandem, and World War II would be coming. In Germany, you know that the Kaiser Wilhelm II, he was overthrown in a revolution. It started with sailors that revolted, and then it spread throughout the country, and so the Kaiser had to flee his own country. He ended up living even into World War II, but he had no power, and so that was the revolution of 1918 in Germany. And sometimes we think, oh, revolution, that's a good thing, but it created instability. Through that, a new republic was set up in Germany. And again, republic sounds good. It was called the Weimar Republic, but it was seen as an instrument of humiliation. The Germans hated the Weimar Republic because it represented their defeat in World War I. And so it was not successful. It was largely corrupt and ineffective, and the economy was terrible, and so people thought that it was the fault of the Weimar Republic. What happened was there was hyperinflation. Usually we have a little bit of inflation where prices rise gradually year by year, and that means that companies, employers have to pay more in wages. But what was happening is crazy hyperinflation all at once, and that meant that money was worthless, and people were taking wheelbarrows of paper bills, stacks and stacks of paper bills, just to buy a loaf of bread. And another problem was all of the warriors from this World War I, they were in need of care, physical care, because they had lost limbs. They could not function in society. They could not work. And so you had high rates of unemployment. And you also had people who were psychologically affected. They called it shell shock. Today we would say PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that they were suffering and they had nobody to help them. Hitler was one of those people. He was gassed in World War I. He was fighting in World War I, and he was affected by mustard gas, and he hated the enemy, which was France. And so this hatred of enemies Not just foreign enemies, but anybody who was seen as helping out the foreigners, those people were hated at home. And in Germany, that meant the Jewish people. Jewish people had been persecuted for centuries and centuries as being different, and then they had been successful, and their success was basically they were accused of stealing money and cheating people, and instead of just being business owners that were very smart and savvy. So all of this would lead to not only Hitler, but a population that was ready to accept Hitler, his racism, his murder, his genocide, his Holocaust. I don't want to end on that note. I want you to see that God always has a way through the darkest times. And the heroism of soldiers who fought in World War I, it is remembered today. We remember it on November 11th. Today it's called Veterans Day, but it used to be called Armistice Day. And the idea is we need to remember so that we don't repeat history's mistakes. Famous man Arnold Toynbee said, "We need to learn from history or we are doomed to repeat its mistakes." And so that's why I'm teaching you history. Thanks for listening.